A dear patron tagged me in a Twitter exchange about a lobster pillow. It looked super cute and soft, and the reviews were reasonable, so of course I had to buy it. So, he's definitely soft. The material and the squishiness, very soft. 10 out of 10 on there, but I think my lobster's seen some stuff. The padding is very uneven and lumpy. There's wrinkles that I don't think are ever going to come out. Like, he's got this sucker mark on his cheek, and that's probably never going to come out. And the general shape would suggest that he's been in one too many fights and is going to spend the rest of his days in quiet contemplation of the dominance hierarchy. Moral of the story is I should stop buying novelty pillows from Amazon, because when I do it, I get traumatized lobsters or anger issue seals. Oh, hi there, little dragon. You kind of look like a chaos dragon. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, I'm Cass. I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I've been working through Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos, and looking at the arguments and logic and the empirical support behind those. And we are up to Rule 10, be precise in your speech. And Peterson's apparent lack of precision in his speech so far is an interesting writing choice, to say the least. A quick reminder about the visual cues indicating what mode we're in. This indicates that I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm giving my personal take on things or integrating Peterson's writing with science. There's no Peterson references, so it's just going to be stuff I'm bringing to the party. And yeah, maybe these sections will have help on how to be precise in communication. Let's start this with a non-textual comment. The broad message for what we're covering today isn't bad on the surface. When things are going smoothly, we tend to not worry about how things are working behind the scenes. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's only when things do break that we tend to look into things and figure out how things work. And I'd even go so far to agree with the implication in this section that it's good to take a peek under the hood when things are working, be it in your car or social structures in your life. But then there's the part of the 12 Rules for Life reading process where you go beyond that surface level meaning and something in your brain just starts crying in the corner. What's included in this video is not the worst that this chapter has to offer, dear viewer. Oh no, it's just foreshadowing of what's to come.
It is very difficult to make sense of the interconnected chaos of reality just by looking at it. It's a very complicated act, requiring perhaps half our brains. Everything shifts and changes in the real world. Each hypothetically separate thing is made up of smaller hypothetically separate things and is simultaneously part of larger hypothetically separate things. The boundaries between the levels and between different things themselves at a given level are neither clear nor self-evident objectively. They must be established practically, pragmatically, and they retain their validity only under very narrow and specified conditions.
Until we live in a world where a sizable chunk of the population doesn't still think that we only use 10% of our brains, this brain percentage devoted to vision is going to need a citation, even if it's right. I also don't disagree that being able to see is a complicated process that requires a fat chunk of neural processing. But I'd hardly say that it's difficult to make sense of just by looking at it. We seem to do it mostly fine without much of a second thought in most situations. Also, this clarification about the real world being in a state of flux has me wondering what the not real world is in this context. Virtual reality? Video games? Paintings? This middle chunk sounds like he's talking about some theories of how we see objects, specifically the recognition by components theory. The idea here is that we have some basic perceptual shapes, called geons, that are like building blocks we use to parse and construct a representation of the visual world. We see a complex object, note the arrangement of geons making up its shape, and this arrangement is compared to what we've got in memory to identify that object. Typically, 3 geons is enough to be able to identify stuff. The rest of what he says, though, about levels and all that, make me question if he's talking about object recognition there. As with the first video for this chapter, I don't quite know how to approach what he said here. As discussed in my perceptual organization video, we are able to see the boundaries between things. Yes, it takes experience with the world at a critical period of life, but assuming you've had that, you can see where the boundaries are. This also seems to contradict what he said earlier in the chapter, where he claimed that we perceive meaning directly. I would think if we could directly perceive meaning, then the different objects would be clear. But all of this may be a consequence of Peterson just flipping which meaning of perception he's working with here.
The conscious illusion of complete and sufficient perception only sustains itself, for example, only remains sufficient for our purposes when everything goes according to plan. Under such circumstances, what we see is accurate enough so that there is no utility in looking farther.
I guess I could see this being right. Like the perceptual grouping and depth cues we rely on work when things are going to plan, if that is taken to mean that the world isn't pulling a fast one on us. And we do have to look further when abnormalities do happen, like with illusions. I don't know. This is usually when a word's definition flip happens. His example here is of driving a car. Driving a car is a complex task, absolutely. You need to plan your route, pay attention to the stuff around you, stay in your lane, maintain your speed, a bunch of other subtasks of driving. But there is utility in looking further ahead. You need to be able to plan for things going sideways around you, sometimes literally. Oh, that's not what he meant. Silly me. In order to drive, we don't have to perceive how the car works.
The hidden complexities of our private cars only intrude on our consciousness when that machinery fails, or when we collide unexpectedly with something, or something with us. Even in the case of mere mechanical failure, to say nothing of a serious accident, such intrusion is always felt, at least initially, as anxiety-provoking. That's a consequence of emergent uncertainty.
Yep, there's the word definition flip. We're using a different meaning of perception now without any clear indication that there was a shift happening. I hated this game when it first showed up in the book, and I hate it all more now. Once again, I guess you could call this sort of anxiety a response to emergent uncertainty, if you wanted to. But it seems more like an attempt to get this to fit the book's theming than adding a meaningful dimension to the anxiety discussion. Ready to have your mind blown some more?
A car, as we perceive it, is not a thing or an object. It is instead something that takes us somewhere we want to go. It is only when it stops taking us and going, in fact, that we perceive it much at all.
Peterson explains that when a car breaks down or is involved in an accident of some form are the only times when we're confronted with what makes a car go. You may think I'm joking, but it's like Peterson assumes that everyone will be this meme when their car no work. Thanks for bringing your car in, sir. What seems to be the problem with it today?
It won't roam, but it should be vroom. When our car fails, our incompetence with regards to its complexity is instantly revealed. It won't vroom, but it should be vroom. That has practical consequences. We don't get to go where we were going, as well as psychological. Our peace of mind disappears along with our functioning vehicle. We must generally turn to the experts who inhabit garages and workshops to restore both functionality to our vehicle and simplicity to our perceptions. That's Mechanic-as-psychologist.
Comments in reverse order because it's my video. First, if you will kindly remember back to the friendship chapter, there was a story Peterson shared about a couple people visiting him when he was in college. In this story, we got the detail that one of the guys was doing groundskeeping. Peterson said that this sort of career was basically unacceptable for anyone smart. So, putting these quotes together, some skilled labor jobs are for the dumbs, but not all skilled labor jobs because some skilled labor people get to be experts. Am I putting these things together right? Because it seems like they're fitting together this way. Second, I don't know about your guys' experience, but for most of my life, taking the car to a mechanic was something that we avoided for as long as we could. When you don't have extra money lying around and there's no mass transit, like half the places I've lived in, taking your sole means of transportation, even if it's not running the best, to somebody who may charge you more than you have allotted for food in that month to possibly not even fix what's wrong with it, it's just not something we did. And this is the point where some Lobster stands might get upset with me because I'm bringing in a discussion that Peterson hadn't intended with his original writing. But this discussion is absolutely relevant here, especially as we continue forward. Also, I'm not trying to play the victim here. I'm not trying to get oppression points or whatever. I'm sharing a different perspective than the one that Peterson is conveying. That's all. The consequence of car not room is bad for most people, but the type of bad varies drastically. When I was growing up, a car out of commission meant that one of my parents was likely going to be missing work until my dad fixed it. My mom might be able to call in some favors and get a couple rides to work, but it was a huge ask because we lived well away from the center of town and where everybody else lived. For someone I knew in middle school, if one of their parents' cars was acting a little bit funny, they'd take it to the shop and get a loaner car until it was fixed. My point here is that there was no Mechanic-as-psychologist for my family. We couldn't afford it. Same is true for a lot of families.
It is precisely then that we can understand, although we seldom deeply consider, the staggeringly low resolution quality of our vision and the inadequacy of our corresponding understanding. In a crisis, when our thing no longer goes, we turn to those whose expertise far transcends ours to restore the match between our expectant desire and what actually happens.
I don't see how car no room, therefore mechanic, supports the low resolution vision claim. Some people's mechanical understanding of their car, sure, but not the vision part. If our vision was this low quality, the mechanic would be no better than we are.
This all means that the failure of our car can also force us to confront the uncertainty of the broader social context, which is usually invisible to us, in which the machine and mechanic are mere parts. Betrayed by our car, we come up against all the things we don't know. Is it time for a new vehicle? Did I err in my original purchase? Is the mechanic competent, honest, and reliable? Is the garage he works for trustworthy?
And this is why I went on that tangent earlier about my childhood experience with cars. One example out of many, because when you're in this situation, it just ends up being a cycle of throwing money down the shitter. My first car was from a junkyard and cost a couple $100s. It was more cost-effective to have me driving that piece of shit than my parents trying to coordinate picking me up or dropping me off at extracurriculars, and I was in a couple. Plus, it saved me from the hellish ride home on the bus, and I think that was the camel that broke the straw's back for my mom, was hearing about the bus stories. So, yes, having a bad car was better than not having a car, but it was still a piece of shit. And what made it a piece of shit? Well, it was a 12-year-old clunker from a junkyard. It didn't have AC in a climate where you really needed to have AC. The speedometer didn't work for like a whole year until my husband felt sorry for me and bought me the replacement part so I could have a functional speedometer. Those things could be forgiven, except for the fourth. It would just strand me places. It was a car that just, didn't feel like working anymore. I lost track of how many times I would be stranded at school, at a gas station, at an astronomy viewing party. It didn't feel like working now. And yeah, my mechanical knowledge may be lacking in this regard, but I would have Dr. Mr. the husband with me after a certain point, and it didn't change the car just randomly dying on us, leaving us stranded or late for something, and me having a bit of a breakdown because this was my life. This had always been my life. A series of breaking or broken down cars and the inability to change the situation. The point here. Some of these questions Peterson rattles off were also asked by my family. Is it time for a new vehicle? Did I err in my original purchase? But I imagine the tone and the weight behind those questions as being like night and day. As a kid, we were stuck with what we had. If it was a bad purchase, you better hope that it lives long enough to be able to replace it with another junker. If it was time for a new car, check the thrifty nickel, start calling around at the junkyards to find something that would work. Not really what you wanted, just something that would work. The more well-off family I mentioned would just get a new car. Like that. And then I'd hear about it from my friend how awful her weekend was because they were stuck at the dealership and they had to test drive all the cars. It was so hard to pick. Experiences from childhood can hang around a bit, and it does bother me a little bit when somebody writes about their experience on this being universal when it isn't. Moving on. These questions about the mechanic's integrity reminds me of what Peterson said about laptops not working in developing countries, basically because of corruption. And if you take your car to someone shady, I suppose it'll work about as well as a laptop with uncertain power. But I'm not sure I like where this is going, with regards to being precise in language. Now, a new variant of the raisin cookie of doom spiral. The catastrophizing spiral of doom.
Sometimes, too, we must contemplate something worse, something broader and deeper. Have the roads now become too dangerous? Have I become, or always been, too incompetent? Too scattered and inattentive? Too old?
As someone who has done a bit of catastrophizing, sometimes the answer to these sorts of questions is yes. Maybe you did hit that park truck because you were too scattered, but it doesn't have to be nihilism from there on out. Learn from the experience. Do better. However, this needs to be balanced against the hypervigilance that's come up earlier in this book. Do not be so on guard about your competence, attention, or age that you can't actually focus on the task itself. And this is where that little thing in my mind threw its first red flag for this section. I've talked a little bit about gaslighting in previous videos. If you're not familiar, in some manipulative and/or abusive relationships, the manipulator tries to get their partner's sense of reality distorted and may have them questioning their beliefs, their memories, their abilities, or even their sanity. That flag got tripped here for me because the abusive acts of my friend Lily would do this to her on precisely these things, minus the age. He'd convince her that she was wrong on things or doing things wrong to the point where she started to question her competence. Oddly enough, some of it was focused on her driving ability. He tried to get her to believe that she was just a dangerous driver, should not be driving, hazard on the road, and that is absolutely not the case. She is a very safe driver. The ex would hide things like her keys or her wallet, then accuse her of being too scattered to remember where she put it. He would unlock things like the doors and the windows, then come at her for not paying attention and being more mindful of things, leaving herself open to getting attacked or robbed. Now, with all that being said, am I saying that Peterson is trying to gaslight the readers as Lily's ex had done to her? Of course not. I'm just urging caution when taking stock of your abilities or capabilities. Yes, underskilled and overconfident is a combination that can happen, but personal opinion, you shouldn't be so fixated on that worry that you either start making mistakes because of that worry or feel like you can't or shouldn't even try. I'm also taking this as an opportunity to reiterate that if somebody is questioning you on a lot of these things a lot, or acting in other ways like my friend's ex, that's not okay. That's not a normal, healthy relationship to have with somebody. Granted, if we are talking about somebody who is well up in age and their vision and reaction time isn't what it used to be, it might be time to have a difficult chat about arranging things that is safe for everybody. Let's move on before I fall further down this nuance hole.
The limitations of all our perceptions of things and selves manifest themselves when something we can usually depend on in our simplified world breaks down. Then the more complex world that was always there, invisible and conveniently ignored, makes its presence known. It is then that the walled garden we archetypally inhabit reveals its hidden but ever-present snakes.
To start by somewhat agreeing with Peterson, let's revisit the car no room example before moving on to the examples 2020 has so graciously provided us. So first, yes, we tend to ignore how things work until they stop working. Going back to the car example, this is why preventative maintenance is a good idea. While it's working, check how things are going before it ends up in a broken situation. But to dig in a little, I think there's variability on how high that archetypal wall gets to be based on socioeconomic status, or SES. As described, I couldn't depend on my car at all. In this metaphor, I would have been stranded in the chaos snake pit. I didn't have the luxury of ignoring the workings of my car because it frequently didn't work at all. But I think something that Peterson's missing here is that there are many things that people in the higher SES tiers just get to ignore that people in the lower SES tiers have to wrestle with on the regular. And I can already hear somebody furiously typing in the comments that I'm missing the point, and of course a purple-haired SJW would try to bring class into this. And to that, I would ask, what does any of this have to do with being precise in your speech? What is any of the chapters so far? Second example, the current situation. Prior to this, most of us didn't give a second thought to the plague rats that we are in our day-to-day lives, touching all the things, spreading all the germs, sometimes getting sick in the process. But those little nasties are always there, and people with compromised immune systems have been having to take precautions and deal with it while the rest of us just keep spreading the nasty. But in the current situation, we've been advised to take the same sorts of precautions that immunocompromised people have been doing for some time. Third example, the currently big but ongoing situation. I don't know why this was the time for it to gain traction, but at the time of writing and recording this video, a lot of white people have gotten behind and supported movements that are working to change at least part of the shitty reality that minorities face in the US. As Peterson describes, that complex world was always there, invisible and conveniently ignored, at least for those of us who have the luxury of doing so. But that's at the heart of privilege, isn't it? Being able to live in the walled garden of order with a capital O while not having to worry about being shot by the police. However, in these three examples, the metaphor is let's call it a loose description. There's the issue of class differences for how much we get to ignore the hidden, complex world. There's the detail that in the current situation, the simplified world didn't break down so much as the world itself got more complex for a bit. Social distancing, face masking in public, upheaval and termination of many jobs, and revamping the jobs and education that didn't end. Similar to the last point, it's not that the simplified world broke down for the white population. For the metaphor to fit the situation, I would think that there would have been a shift so that it wasn't just black people facing more extreme force from the police to everyone facing that same force. That would be the simple world breaking down. Then, having been exposed to this treatment, white people would have direct knowledge of the complex world and then work to change it. Instead of that, though, there's been a shift to listen to the black population, followed by work to change the status quo. To painfully extend the phrasing, the complex world didn't intrude. Some white people have chosen to stop ignoring it. Now, of course, Peterson didn't write this having knowledge of what would be happening in 2020. It isn't necessarily his fault that his metaphor doesn't fit the examples that I brought in that kind of sort of match what he's talking about. But that leads me to my next point. We're able to have these sorts of discussions and tangents because of how vague this writing is. Perception can mean the basic process of making sense of the world, or the general impression of something, both, neither. Rorschach shouldn't be a writing style when giving life advice. I may as well bust out the fucking tarot and see what the cards are hinting I should do. I can't quite put my finger on it, but this connection between perception and the world's status, being either intact or falling apart, seems off. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out the Jung here. It's unsurprising at this point that Peterson would consider normal life situations as existing within the archetypal walled order garden. Finally, what does any of this have to do with precise language? Continuing on with the simplified world breaking down idea from the end of the last section.
When things break down, what has been ignored rushes in. When things are no longer specified with precision, the walls crumble and chaos makes its presence known. When we've been careless and let things slide, what we have refused to attend to gathers itself up, adopts a serpentine form, and strikes, often at the worst possible moment. It is then that we see what focused intent, precision of aim, and careful attention protect us from.
Chaos Toad's back in season, y'all! He's got a clarifying example that we'll get to in the next video, but for now, I feel like all these strange metaphors from the book, like things falling apart, chaos ascending because we weren't more careful, not paying attention biting us in the ass, and having a precise aim, are all being thrown in a blender, and this is the result. But at least we're finally getting to what any of this has to do with being precise in your language. Sort of. Pika? Where'd you go? Pika? Pika?
Pikachu!